The room fell silent as Pam Bondi took her seat in the spotlight, her gaze unwavering. Across from her sat Nancy Pelosi, the woman who had reigned over the House of Representatives for years, a figure of immense power and influence. But today, that power would be challenged in a way that no one had ever expected. The air was thick with anticipation. Bondi, known for her razor-sharp legal mind, was about to face off against Pelosi in what could only be described as a political showdown of epic proportions. Bondi had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering evidence, rallying her supporters, and waiting for the perfect time to strike. Pelosi, on the other hand, sat confidently, her signature smirk plastered on her face. She had weathered countless storms in her political career, and this was just another round of political theater, right? Or so she thought. "Good afternoon, Madam Speaker," Bondi began, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "I trust you're ready for the truth." Pelosi's smirk faltered for a moment, but only briefly. "The truth?" She scoffed. "You don't scare me, Pam. What are you going to do? Throw baseless accusations at me like you've done with everyone else?" Bondi leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Pelosi's. "No. I'm about to expose what you've been hiding for far too long. And the world will finally see you for who you truly are." The audience shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing that this was no ordinary confrontation. This was something more. Bondi had something in her back pocket, and Pelosi knew it. With a calm yet firm gesture, Bondi slid a stack of documents across the table, each page filled with damning details, secret deals, and undeniable evidence that Pelosi had tried to bury. "We've spent months reviewing your actions, your decisions, and the shady dealings you've been involved in. These are the facts, Nancy. And they don't lie," Bondi continued, her voice growing in intensity. Pelosi's confidence began to crack as she glanced at the papers before her. But instead of conceding, she pressed on, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think these papers mean anything? They're just documents, Pam. Everyone knows how easy it is to fabricate lies in Washington." But Bondi wasn't fazed. "It's not about the papers. It's about what they reveal. The truth will be undeniable, and when it's all laid out, your reign will come to an end." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to be unveiled, for the very foundation of Pelosi's political empire to begin crumbling. Bondi had just begun. Pam Bondi wasted no time. She flipped open the first page of the stack of documents, and the room fell into an eerie hush. The audience leaned in, the tension so thick it felt almost suffocating. "Let's start with this one, shall we?" Bondi's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. She pointed to a document detailing an alleged backroom deal between Pelosi and several high-profile donors, one that implicated her in using her political position for personal gain. The evidence was irrefutable: email exchanges, wire transfers, and internal memos. Nancy Pelosi's face twitched, her well-practiced smile faltering ever so slightly. She cleared her throat, but there was no hiding the nervous energy that had begun to build within her. "These are nothing more than fabricated claims." Pelosi snapped, her composure starting to slip. She reached for the papers, but Bondi swiftly pushed them further out of her reach. "Fabricated, huh?" Bondi raised an eyebrow, unshaken. "I don't think so. Here, let's take a look at the emails, shall we?" Bondi read aloud one of the exchanges where Pelosi had reportedly discussed sweetening the deal with campaign contributions in exchange for legislative favors. The room grew tense as the audience digested the damning content. Pelosi's usual steely demeanor was slipping fast. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "This is a witch hunt." Pelosi finally burst out, her voice rising. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Pam. These documents are irrelevant." But Bondi was not about to let Pelosi off the hook. "Relevance? Nancy, you've been using your position to benefit your own interests, and it's time the public knew about it. I've got more, much more." She continued flipping through the pages, each one presenting new allegations, each more damaging than the last. One of the documents revealed a secret meeting Pelosi had allegedly attended, where political opponents were discussed, and strategy sessions were held to destroy their reputations. Bondi's voice was unwavering as she exposed the manipulation and deceit behind Pelosi's tactics. "You see, Nancy," Bondi said with a grim smile, "this isn't just about politics. This is about the people you've betrayed. The lies you've told to climb higher and higher, using your power as a weapon. And now it's all coming back to haunt you." Pelosi's face had gone pale, her calm and calculated facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The evidence was irrefutable, and there was no turning back now. Bondi had struck, and Pelosi's empire was beginning to fall apart. The room seemed to shrink as Bondi made her next move, the undeniable weight of the evidence hanging in the air. The audience was silent, watching intently, as if they knew they were witnessing something historic. The carefully crafted image of Nancy Pelosi, the stalwart political figure who had once been hailed as a champion of her party, was crumbling before their eyes. Bondi didn't hesitate. She pulled out the final piece of the puzzle, a series of recorded phone calls between Pelosi and high-ranking members of the party, in which they discussed strategies to undermine key votes, discredit opposition, and manipulate public opinion to protect their own interests. The tapes were damning, revealing a level of corruption that went beyond mere politics. It was a betrayal of the very principles she had once claimed to uphold. "The truth always comes out," Bondi said coldly, her eyes never leaving Pelosi's now visibly shaken form. She pressed play on the recorder, and the room filled with the sound of Pelosi's voice, speaking with an ease and familiarity that sent chills through the audience. "Make sure the media spins this the right way," Pelosi's voice could be heard saying on the tape. "We need them to blame the Republicans for the failures. If we control the narrative, we control the game. Don't let them see the truth." The room erupted into murmurs, as the gravity of the moment settled in. Bondi allowed the tape to finish before speaking again, her words deliberate, each one a final nail in Pelosi's coffin. "Your words, Nancy," Bondi continued, "reveal exactly who you are. Someone who has used their position for personal gain, someone who has manipulated the media and the people for your own political advantage. You've lost your moral high ground, and now the truth is out for everyone to see." Pelosi's face had drained of color, the smirk replaced by a look of pure disbelief. She had no retort, no defense. The lies she had carefully spun over the years were unraveling before her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her grip on power was slipping away. "You've ruled with an iron fist, Nancy," Bondi said, her voice ringing with authority. "But power built on lies and deceit doesn't last. Your time is over." There was a long, tense silence before Bondi spoke again, this time in a tone that was unmistakable. "The people deserve better than this. They deserve the truth." And with that, the final blow was delivered. Pelosi's reign had been shattered, her empire reduced to dust. The undeniable truth had taken her down, and the world would never see her the same way again. Bondi turned and walked away, leaving Pelosi seated at the table, a figure who had once stood tall in Washington but was now forever tarnished by the very truth she had tried to bury. The room, once filled with tension, now buzzed with the energy of something seismic, a political earthquake. The world had just witnessed a dethroning. The aftershocks of the confrontation rippled through Washington, D.C. in the days that followed. Pam Bondi had taken down one of the most powerful figures in American politics, and the ramifications were impossible to ignore. Every major news outlet covered the explosive showdown, with pundits dissecting every word, every piece of evidence. The nation was divided, some praising Bondi for exposing the truth, while others condemned her actions as a partisan attack. For Nancy Pelosi, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Her approval ratings plummeted as the public processed the full scope of the revelations. What had once been a political career marked by leadership and success was now overshadowed by scandal and betrayal. She faced mounting pressure from within her own party, as fellow Democrats questioned whether they could continue to stand behind her. Within hours, rumors spread that Pelosi was considering stepping down from her leadership role. But the real test came when she faced her fellow House members in a private meeting. The room was tense, thick with uncertainty. For the first time in her career, Pelosi felt vulnerable, something that had been foreign to her for decades. She sat at the head of the table, surrounded by allies and adversaries alike. The familiar faces of longtime political allies, who had once stood by her through thick and thin, now looked at her with a mix of sympathy and disdain. It was clear that the political landscape had shifted, and Pelosi was no longer the towering figure she once was. "How could you let this happen, Nancy?" one of her longtime supporters, Representative John McFadden, asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Pelosi's usual sharp retort was gone. She had no answers. No excuses. The documents, the tapes, the public outrage, they had all caught up with her. For the first time, Pelosi felt the weight of her own actions, the consequences of her decades of political maneuvering. Her grip on power was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "I never thought it would come to this," Pelosi admitted, her voice quiet, almost resigned. "But I've spent so many years playing the game. Maybe I've forgotten what the game was really about." Across the room, another voice spoke up, this time from a younger, rising star within the party. "Maybe it's time for a new direction," she said, her tone both compassionate and firm. "We need a leader who isn't just about winning, but about restoring trust. And right now, that trust is gone." The room fell silent. Pelosi looked around at the faces staring back at her, some with pity, others with the cold indifference of political necessity. She knew, deep down, that her time had come to an end. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the meeting, Pam Bondi was basking in the victory of a lifetime. The media had crowned her a political hero, and her name was on everyone's lips. But Bondi wasn't interested in the accolades. She knew that this was just the beginning. The truth had prevailed, but there was still more work to be done. Bondi had set her sights on exposing the corruption that ran deep within Washington, and Pelosi was only the first domino to fall. The question was, who would be next? As Pelosi's political career teetered on the brink of collapse, Bondi's message was clear: no one in Washington, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. The truth was coming for everyone. The weeks following the downfall of Nancy Pelosi were nothing short of chaotic. Bondi's triumph in exposing the truth had set off a political firestorm that wasn't going out anytime soon. Washington was in turmoil, with both Democrats and Republicans scrambling to assess the damage. No one, it seemed, was safe. Inside Pelosi's office, the once dominant figure was now a shadow of herself. She had been forced into hiding, avoiding public appearances, as her party tried to stabilize and salvage what little remained of her leadership. The pressure to resign grew by the day, not just from the media but from her own party, who knew that keeping her around would only continue to drag them further into scandal. On Capitol Hill, the corridors that were once filled with respect for Pelosi now whispered of her fall. But those whispers weren't just about Pelosi. They were about everyone in Washington who had used their power for personal gain. Bonds of trust had been shattered, and no one knew who would be next to face Bondi's unflinching pursuit of the truth. Bondi, meanwhile, was on a mission to keep the pressure up. The world was watching, and she had no intention of letting anyone off the hook. Her work had only just begun. The public had witnessed her destroy Pelosi with undeniable facts, and now she had set her sights on the next target. Rumors began to spread of her meeting with whistleblowers, former aides, and insiders who were ready to spill the secrets of those who had long been shielded from the public eye. Each conversation was another thread in a vast tapestry of corruption, and Bondi was determined to pull on every single one. Her next move came unexpectedly. Late one evening, Bondi released a statement. The words were clear and direct: no one is safe. The truth is coming for everyone who has used their power for personal gain. I won't stop until we've rooted out the corruption at the heart of our government. The ripple effect of her declaration was immediate. Congress was thrown into a frenzy. Phone calls were made in hushed tones. Deals were struck behind closed doors, as politicians who had once felt untouchable suddenly felt exposed. No one knew who was next in Bondi's sights, but they all feared it could be them. The media was captivated. News outlets broadcasted Bondi's every move, every word, as if the nation was waiting for the next revelation. The fear of exposure had taken root, and it was starting to change the dynamics of power in Washington. Pelosi, who had once commanded the room with her presence, was now a symbol of what happens when secrets are uncovered and power is wielded recklessly. She was being kept in the shadows, isolated from the party she had led for years, as the calls for her resignation continued to grow louder. In her private moments, Pelosi's mind raced. She had never once imagined her career would end like this, with her name dragged through the mud by a woman she had underestimated. But now, with each passing day, the truth became harder to deny. The narrative had shifted. She had been dethroned, her legacy forever tarnished by the very truth that Bondi had fought so hard to reveal. For Bondi, the fight was personal. This wasn't just about political battles or public opinion, this was about justice. She had seen the corruption in Washington firsthand, and now she was on a mission to root it out. She had already brought down one titan, but she knew that the deeper she dug, the more enemies she would make. It didn't matter. She wasn't backing down. And so, as the sun set on Washington, the fight for accountability was just beginning. Bondi had shown that no matter how entrenched the power, no matter how long someone had held sway, the truth would find a way to rise to the surface. And it was coming for everyone who had built their empire on lies. The tension in Washington had reached a breaking point. Pam Bondi's relentless pursuit of truth had shaken the political establishment to its core. Every move she made was being scrutinized, and every new revelation sent shockwaves through the halls of power. The next target was unclear, but the atmosphere was charged with fear, uncertainty, and paranoia. Inside Pelosi's office, the once proud Speaker of the House was now a pariah. The days of commanding attention with a flick of her finger had passed. Her phone calls went unanswered, her emails ignored. Her fellow Democrats, who had once eagerly aligned with her in the battle for political dominance, were now distancing themselves. Even those closest to her were beginning to question their loyalty, as the stain of scandal spread like wildfire. Late one evening, Bondi made a public appearance that would change everything. She had kept her cards close to her chest, but now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Stepping out into the spotlight at a press conference, Bondi's demeanor was as calm and composed as ever. She was prepared for whatever came next. The world was watching, and she wasn't about to disappoint. "Good evening," Bondi began, her voice steady. "The truth is out, and now it's time to clean up the mess." The cameras flashed as reporters leaned forward in anticipation. Every word Bondi spoke seemed to carry the weight of history. "Nancy Pelosi may be the first to fall, but she won't be the last. Our government has been built on lies, deception, and backroom deals that have kept the people in the dark for far too long. But not anymore. I'm going after everyone who has exploited their power for personal gain." The room fell silent. The audacity of her statement echoed throughout the press hall. Bondi's words were a direct challenge to every politician who had ever felt safe in their position. "I'm not just talking about Nancy Pelosi," she continued, her eyes locking with the cameras. "I'm talking about everyone who thought they could hide behind the veil of power and influence. I'm coming for you. The truth will set this country free, and I will stop at nothing to make sure it does." The implications were immediate. Bondi's declaration wasn't just a call to arms, it was a promise, one that sent ripples of fear throughout Washington. The days of unchecked power were over, and the political establishment knew it. Behind closed doors, panic set in. Powerful figures who had once operated with impunity now realized they could no longer hide. Names that had been whispered about in hushed tones were suddenly being written down in investigative reports. Bondi had created a political storm, and no one was sure who would be left standing when the dust settled. Pelosi, already reeling from the public humiliation, was now confronted with the reality that her fall from grace had triggered a much larger movement. Her resignation was all but imminent. The party she had once led was in disarray, and there were no assurances that anyone could pick up the pieces. Her name, once synonymous with political might, was now a cautionary tale. As Bondi's power and influence grew, so did the fractures within the establishment. Long-standing alliances were beginning to unravel. Washington's deep state, the very system of interconnected interests that had sustained itself for decades, was starting to crack under the pressure. Everyone who had once trusted the system now began to question it. And those who had been complicit in keeping the truth hidden were scrambling to cover their tracks. Bondi's next steps were clear, but they were also dangerous. She had already faced threats from Pelosi's allies, and the forces working to protect the entrenched political power were not going to give up easily. But for Bondi, there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, and now the truth was her weapon. "I'm not done yet," Bondi declared as she prepared to take the next step in her campaign for political accountability. "I will expose every last person who thinks they are above the law. The reckoning is just beginning." And so, the countdown to a new era of political transparency had begun. Washington was no longer a safe haven for the powerful and corrupt. With Bondi leading the charge, the system was about to be torn apart, piece by piece, lie by lie. The intensity of the political storm Bondi had set in motion was now impossible to ignore. Washington, D.C., was in turmoil. Behind the polished facades of the Capitol and the White House, anxiety simmered as the truth continued to ripple outward, exposing the rot beneath the surface. No one, regardless of their position, felt safe anymore. Bondi's words had lit a fire under the country's political elites. Her calculated threats to expose everyone who had used their power for personal gain had become more than just a slogan, they were a war cry. With Pelosi's fall, it was clear that no one was untouchable. Her investigation had unearthed the underbelly of Washington, and now more powerful names were at risk of being implicated. As the media reported on Bondi's every move, her influence grew. The public, previously skeptical of a political outsider like her, now saw her as a symbol of accountability. Where once she had been a respected but largely behind-the-scenes figure, Bondi had now become a political force to be reckoned with. The halls of Congress had grown tense, and rumors swirled about which major political figures were next on Bondi's radar. In private meetings, some of Washington's most entrenched politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike, began to fear what was coming next. Bondi was known for her meticulous planning and her unyielding focus. The truth she had already exposed was just the beginning. The deeper she dug, the more corruption she found, and the more it threatened to pull apart the very foundation of the political system. But it wasn't just the elites who felt the tremors of this reckoning. The people, the very voters who had been misled and manipulated for decades, were watching, and they were hungry for more. There were protests in the streets, calls for a complete overhaul of the system. The narrative had shifted. The public was no longer willing to accept the status quo. They wanted justice. And Bondi, with her singular focus on exposing the truth, had become the unlikely hero in their eyes. As the weeks wore on, Bondi's investigation led to yet another major breakthrough. A whistleblower from a powerful lobbying group came forward, offering a treasure trove of documents that connected several high-ranking officials to under-the-table deals, secret negotiations, and dirty money. This was the smoking gun Bondi had been waiting for. With this information, she could bring down an entire network of corruption. But there was a cost to this revelation. Bondi knew that the stakes had never been higher. The more she revealed, the more dangerous the game became. Powerful figures, who had long operated in the shadows, would stop at nothing to protect their interests. And as the evidence mounted, so did the threats. It was clear that Bondi's pursuit of the truth had made her a target. Late one night, Bondi received an anonymous message, a warning. It was a thinly veiled threat, one that didn't mince words: "Stop now, or the consequences will be far greater than you realize." The message was chilling, but Bondi wasn't about to back down. In fact, it only fueled her resolve. "I didn't come this far to stop now," she muttered to herself as she stared at the screen. "The truth will come out, no matter what." And so, the investigation continued. Bondi had become the spearhead of a political revolution, and the establishment knew that the walls were closing in. The system that had been so carefully constructed over decades was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, and there was no going back. As Bondi prepared to reveal the next batch of explosive findings, she knew that the battle was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. There were still powerful figures hiding in the shadows, still deals to be exposed, and still more secrets to be uncovered. The truth had become the most powerful weapon in Bondi's arsenal. And she wasn't going to stop until Washington was finally held accountable for its lies. The pressure on Pam Bondi had never been greater. With each new revelation, each new exposé, the stakes soared higher. The political battlefield in Washington had become a war zone, and Bondi was at the front lines, wielding the truth like a sword, cutting through the thick layers of corruption that had entangled the Capitol for decades. Her latest discovery was the most explosive yet. Documents had surfaced that linked multiple high-ranking senators, a few governors, and even some members of the Supreme Court to a massive, multi-billion-dollar scheme involving offshore accounts, corporate bribes, and illegal lobbying. The scope of the corruption was staggering, and Bondi knew that this was the final blow that would bring down the system as a whole. She held a press conference, her voice steady but fierce as she revealed the magnitude of what she had uncovered. "I have just received evidence that will change everything. We are not talking about one corrupt individual. We are talking about a system that has been designed to protect the rich and powerful while leaving the people to fend for themselves. This stops now." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs as Bondi laid out the damning details: the money laundering, the shadowy deals, the blatant disregard for the law by the very people who were supposed to uphold it. She named names, senators, governors, judges, and connected the dots, showing how deeply the corruption had run. Every eye in the country was on her now. The moment of truth had arrived. But as Bondi spoke, a sense of foreboding hung in the air. She knew that the powerful figures she was exposing wouldn't go down quietly. And they didn't. The next day, Bondi received a chilling phone call. The voice on the other end was cold, devoid of emotion. "You think you can just tear everything down and walk away unscathed? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Bondi's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I'm not backing down. The truth has to come out." The threat was clear: they would do whatever it took to stop her. The forces she was up against were willing to play dirty, but Bondi had no intention of letting that scare her. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let them silence her now. That evening, she prepared to release the final piece of the puzzle, the full investigation that would lay bare the corruption in Washington once and for all. But just as she was about to hit send on her computer, something unexpected happened. A group of protesters, emboldened by Bondi's revelations, had gathered outside her office. They chanted her name, demanding justice. The streets were filled with people who, for the first time in a long while, felt they had a voice. Bondi knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the American people. The truth had become a movement, one that couldn't be stopped. As Bondi stepped out onto the balcony, facing the crowd, she felt the weight of the moment. This is it, she thought. The end of the beginning. The next morning, news outlets across the country were ablaze with headlines. Bondi's final report had been released, and it was more explosive than anyone had imagined. The names were all there: public officials, corporate moguls, and even high-ranking figures in the judiciary, caught in a web of greed, deceit, and betrayal. It was the ultimate reckoning. As the public demanded accountability, the pressure on Washington grew unbearable. The president, once shielded by his political allies, found himself caught in the wave of revelations, forced to issue statements, and pledge investigations. The system, for all its power and influence, had crumbled. Pelosi's resignation was only the beginning. The wave of political resignations, scandals, and investigations spread like wildfire. Those who had once thought they were invincible were now running for cover, their reputations destroyed by the truth Bondi had exposed. No longer could anyone claim immunity from the scrutiny that was now sweeping the nation. Pam Bondi had become more than just a political figure. She had become a symbol of change. She had stood alone against the powerful, against the entrenched interests that had held the country in their grip for so long. And she had won. The truth, in the end, had triumphed over corruption. As the dust settled and the full scope of her victory became apparent, Bondi looked out at the country she had fought for. It wasn't just about the fall of Pelosi or the revelations of corruption, it was about the rebirth of a system, one that had been brought to its knees by the very force it had tried to silence, the truth. And as she stood there, knowing the battle had been won, she also knew that the fight for real change was just beginning. Washington was no longer the same. It had been reshaped by the courage of one woman who refused to back down.